Hey guys, Matt from Last Round. Just finished shooting quite a lengthy video on program design. So for the next 8 weeks, we're going to look at building a program for maximising some hypertrophy, maximising some strength, and getting us ready for some athleticism tests that we're going to conduct at the end of the first quarter. So if you want to see how this comes about, how we formulate it, different things that we consider, check out the video attached and maybe jump on board next Monday, kicking off February 3rd. Last round. All right guys, so what I thought I'd do is I'll give you a bit of a walkthrough as to what our programming process looks like for the next 8 weeks. So the plan is at the end of the first quarter we're going to do some testing on both strength and athleticism. But we can't just throw people into that, we need to build them up to it, make sure that we get them in the best possible position that we can so we avoid injury and we make sure that they can not only do the lifts and sprinting safely, which are both very demanding on the body, but also to the point where we're not getting skewed results. So what I mean by that is when you introduce people to a new lift and they're learning it by way of improving their motor patterns and improving their efficiency in the movement, they'll gain some significant strength gains just by virtue of learning the new movement. So it doesn't really give you a true indication of strength gained or anything like that. If we can train the basics up and get a decent baseline where we can perform something that's close to an actual maximal lift, then we're sort of eliminating that very early learning process out of the picture. And with so many new people on the deck this year, thought it was a good opportunity to take that, make sure that everyone progresses at a decent rate and safely. So let's take a bit of a look in the process of how we put these things together, and yeah, we'll walk you through it for the next 7 or so weeks. So we'll work backwards from our testing week, which is going to be the 23rd to the 28th of March. That'll basically take us to the last week in the quarter before we move into April. And we're going to start from week 1, work our way up, gives us 7 clear weeks of training and then 1 week of testing. So from week 1, which commences next Monday, February 3rd to the 8th, we're going to look at a hypertrophy block. So hypertrophy, for those that don't know, is essentially building muscle. So the benefits of hypertrophy block, and we're going to continue this for a few weeks, is that it does a few things for us. Not only are we getting to get a great deal of practice at our fundamental compound movements, such as our squat, our bench and our deadlift, we can fine tune our technique, but we can do it under loading that's not extreme. So generally speaking, our hypertrophy is going to be anywhere between sort of 6 reps on the bottom end, that's tending to get into strength, and then we're going to move through to as much as 20 reps on the top end. And we'll spend most of our time within that particular window of repetitions. That means the loading can be moderate, I suppose, the best way to describe it. So we're building some soft tissue, which is going to then help us when we move into our strength phase later on. We're getting plenty of practice at the movement patterns, which allows us to do that with a little less risk of significant injury because we're using lighter loading than we otherwise would when we move into the strength phase. The other thing that we're going to do during this particular phase is we're going to start working towards our sprint warm-ups and things of that nature, so that when we get to the end, for those that are doing sprint testing, again, we're not going to suffer the normal hamstring, calf-related injuries that we get when we all of a sudden start sprinting and we haven't built up to it over a number of weeks. So hypertrophy for us at the moment, I'm going to say, is going to be around about 4 weeks. Now, it may not be exactly what you think of in regards to a traditional bodybuilding hypertrophy model. There will be elements of athleticism incorporated into it, such as our sprint warm-up, because we are preparing for more than just a bodybuilding contest or a strength contest. So if we run 4 weeks of hypertrophy, we can then run essentially 2 weeks of strength, and then our final week, for those particularly that are doing the athleticism, we can run into power / a little bit of speed, more power than speed as far as being accurate with your assessment of what's power and what's speed. This is going to fall more into the power gambit than it is speed, although there will be some speed related activities in there. So it'll form the basis for how we determine sets, reps, loading, and we will taper it so that this runs into a fairly smooth transition, hopefully, with a lot of other aspects that we incorporate in here. So when we look at hypertrophy, initially we're going to keep it really quite simple. We will look at two-part split on the whole body to start off with. So we're going to start initially, regardless of whether the guys are focusing on a strength stream or an athleticism stream, we're going to get everybody to sprint warm up to start off with. There's no downside to that, gets everything warm, and if they decide to change their mind part way through, they won't be left in a position where I haven't sprinted yet and you want me to do some sprint testing. They'll at least be in a good position to do that. Takes literally 5 minutes extra, so we're going to throw that in there. So it'll be sprint warm-ups, and that'll stay consistent from here all the way through. I will probably expect that the guys who are doing the strength to make a decision by around this point here, because if we can take the extra time from the sprint warm-ups and use them in the strength phase, I would rather do that. But for those doing the athleticism, this particular thing will continue all the way to the top. So for the moment, we'll just draw a line here to say that that's going to run from there to there as a minimum. The other thing that we would look at in a hypertrophy program such as this, we're going to start, there's a bunch of different ways we could break this up, but we're going to start by just looking at a simple 2-day split. So we can go upper and lower.
Yeah, because when you're designing these programs, do you think about like how often the members come in?
Yeah, so it's definitely a consideration. There's a number of different ways you can set up these programs. You can do full body, you can do one body part a day or a couple of body parts a day and split it over 2 or 3 days. You can base it on an upper or lower split, which is what we're doing here. You could base it on a lift, so you could do like bench press and associated upper body exercises. You could do deadlift and associated posterior chain lower body exercises, or you could do squat and associated anterior chain or quad dominant squat exercises, leg exercises. And you can break it up that way. Where I like to do upper and lower body is it makes it a little bit easier for me to segregate people into different groups. It makes it easy then to focus our conditioning pieces. Generally I like to focus, if I'm doing an upper body day down here and we're working with the athletics group, I'll like to try and incorporate something a little more lower body dominant on the conditioning piece. Generally speaking, the way that we conduct our conditioning here, it's quite short in duration. The chances of that lower body conditioning session having any real muscle soreness impact on the next day's performance is low, so there's not really that issue. So you could technically go through the week without having necessarily bad impact from the session previous. Yeah. So when we look at this, we do an upper lower split. We'll probably continue that right through this week here. So we go upper lower and upper lower. So we'll just focus on this hypertrophy block to start off with. So when we're looking at upper lower, down here we're probably going to work between 2 varied rep ranges. So I'm going to be working somewhere in the vicinity of 10 reps per set for our main exercise. So if we had something like our compound exercise, let's run with a singular example rather than just nominating a compound exercise. So let's say if we focused on a squat and what that same movement would look like all the way through this program, and then that way I think people will get a better understanding or a better picture of how it might all integrate in over the course of a number of weeks. So irrespective of which exercise we choose, we can have the same exercise cause a different effect to the body. And when we carefully consider that, we need to look at other things such as tendon strengthening, stability work for the same area. We can't just throw it all in and say we're going to do 5 sets of 10 on squat for 8 weeks or 7 weeks. It's going to give us some result, but perhaps not what we're looking for, so that we optimize our testing at the end here. So we're looking at upper lower split. So let's look at our a squat, for example. So if we do our squat, we might start week 1 down here at 3 by 10 on the squat, and that might be percentage wise at 60% actually. We'll go 60. Early week in, a little lighter than what you could potentially do for maximal weight at sets of 10.
So you're essentially working up to the 8th week where you're hitting your hundreds.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. So what will end up happening is the intensity will rise over this period of time, so will the volume. So if we were doing 10 squats at 60%, first week back into some hypertrophy, that gives us a little bit of room to move. We're into a position there where we're probably within 2 reps of failure. And then by the time we're midway through on this 4th week, we should pretty much be at failure on each of our sets, although the volume will be slightly increased. So we might be doing 10 squats at 60%, and we might superset that. Only 3 sets around, so keep the volume fairly moderate. But you've got to consider that if optimal volume for hypertrophies, look, there's some flexibility on what that looks like depending on who you listen to, but general school of thought at the moment is that it's somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 20 sets per week. So if we consider that, I've got to look at someone that's potentially training 6 days a week. So if we're looking at quad development, for instance, again, some glutes in here as well, obviously, you'd be looking at a lower body split. You would be able to hit that 3 times over the course of your week if you were doing 6 days. And if you're doing 3 sets of 10 on that, that's going to give you 3 by 3, that's 9 sets right there. And so if I put a second exercise in, so something specific, 15 by leg extensions, that's going to, and that might be somewhere down the vicinity of 50%. But realistically, let's face it, when you're doing things like leg extensions, there's not many people that actually have a handle on what their 1RM looks like. So rather than dictate that as a 50%, I would say leave about 2 reps in the tank. So when you get onto the leg extensions, you do your warm-up sequences, you'll figure out how hard is this? You know, what are we looking at, 9 out of 10? I've got a couple of reps left in the tank, or is it an 8 out of 10? So you would generally give yourself a little bit of room to move at this point in the program. We want some room for progression. So that would be a squat sequence here, three sets of 10, supersetted with leg extensions, and then I would put an active rest sequence in there. We might potentially train calves if we had a group that was focused merely on hypertrophy. It would be a good opportunity to throw a calf activity in there. But if we've got an athleticism group going, we probably wouldn't throw that in. We would keep them to this because time-wise, they've got other things that they need to spend some time on. So when we progress our 3 sets of 10 squat here, next week, there's a couple of options. We could either drop the repetitions and add sets, keeping the weight similar or slightly heavier. We can simply up the intensity by telling somebody, all right, well, if we look at this, we might move this to 65% instead of 60%. And by virtue of that, you're going to be, 1 rep from failure or very close to failure. Or we can just simply add more sets. So there's a number of different ways. So that could look at something along the lines of 3 by 12 or 4 by 10, or there's a number of different ways we can tackle it. So what we're going to do, due to, generally speaking, we have kind of, limited time to be able to do huge amounts of volume. So rather than up the number of supersets that I'm going to do, we're still close to our threshold as far as 10 to 20 sets. We're at about 18 sets a week on quads there. So it probably wouldn't manipulate that much further, but what I can do is that I can go 3 sets of 10 here by squat, and I can simply up this percentage, 65%.
You leave the squat, you leave the traditional squat throughout, you don't change up your squat stance or anything, you lead up to a baseline test?
No, so what we will do is we will have, this would be say day 1, day 2 and day 3 will look slightly different. We'll get across to those in a minute. So day 1, we've got just our standard back squat. Day 2, I'll finish this one up and we'll right up to here on this, and then we'll skip across to the subsequent days. So we have the same basic configuration here. So if we're looking at this, let's call this day 1. Actually, I'll put that up a little higher. Joy's working on a whiteboard, normally on a computer.
We're going old school here.
This is it, day 1, boom. So I'm going to scoot across, you're going to look at my back for a minute. Day 2 and day 3. All right, so as far as day 1's concerned, We've got our squat at 65, 15 by leg extensions again, and I might just correct that there. Instead of saying 50%, you go 2 reps. I'm going to put reps in reserve, RIR. So if you see RIR, it's reps in reserve. There's a lot of minutiae that people carry on about, you know, what's the appropriate way to rate effort? Do you use an RPR scale? Do you use how many reps left in the tank? So what they...
Because how honest is the person?
Well, that's right. I mean, you can get whipped up in the details, and I guess people like to come up with a system or something that you can just put in there and go, this is the way that it must be done. You can use percentage scales, you can use bar velocity, you can use any number of different markers in order to determine how hard it is. But essentially, it's going to be up to the individual performing the exercise to go, this week I really need to be pushing hard, this week's not quite as hard, blah, 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 blah. So it's really up to them to sort of interpret that. A lot of these percentages are simply guides so that when people come in feeling lazy, they, you know, feel the obligation, all right, well, am I lazy or am I actually getting close to overtraining here? And that takes a little while for them to interpret that as well. So when we look here, we've got our leg extensions, 2 RIR in reserve, reps in reserve there. We might go to 1 rep in reserve here. And then as we move up, I'm actually going to increase sets here. I'm going to go to 4 by 8. So 3 10s, 30 reps, 4 8s, 32 reps. So we're upping our weekly volume slightly, but because we're moving to 8s, this number can jump. So we might be out here at 75% rather than 65%. And we're punching out our leg extensions again, and leg extension, and we might be 1 RIR once more. And then moving up to our last week, hypertrophy, we go to 4 again. This time, we've only got 2 weeks of strength. So what I'm actually tempted to do, and albeit some of the hypertrophy gurus out there are going to disagree to say that this may not increase hypertrophy because I'm actually reducing volume in this last week, but I am going to go to 4 sets of 6 squat, and it's right on the bottom end of what you might consider hypertrophic sort of range, I guess, but we want to be somewhere between 80%-ish. So what I'm hoping is there'll be less of a transition moving from this to this next sequence here, okay? So loading's going up, going up, going up. So although I am doing slightly less volume, we've still got plenty of volume in here. It's not like we're dipping the volume down to below 10 sets a week, in which case we're not going to be getting a hypertrophic response. So to say that there's not going to be an adaptation here, I think it's a pretty bold statement. I don't think that it's something that you could quantify like that because you are increasing loading, okay? So 15 by leg extensions.
Who do you hold in high regard in terms of research and that sort of stuff?
So there's a few different sources that are pretty, how would you put it, they're pretty across the research and then have the practical application to go with it. So looking at people like Mike Israel's big on volume, has a lot to say about that. There's Brad Schonfeld, a lot of science behind that. Eric Helms, Lane Norton. They're probably the main guys that you look to for that type of information on a regular basis, or at least if it's not them specifically, it's the literature that they've been involved in. Other guys as well have a pretty good way of interpreting the data, blokes like Greg Knuckles and Eric Trexler and people like that. Any of that 3DMJ or Stronger by Science crew are pretty solid on that. I do think that, I guess it's their job though to come up with specifics. You know, I think a lot of people get whipped up in the minutiae of how many sets for this and how many reps for that and how much load exactly, and they all kind of get wrapped up in the details. where in real terms, I think that, you know, getting the extra hours sleep or having, you know, lower stress levels or having, you know, regular routine is going to gain you far more than worrying about whether you're at 62.5% or 65% on the bar, or whether you should be doing 8 sets or 10 sets for that given time frame, or twice a week or 3 times a week. So I guess that's how they make their living, is basically making, you know, best practice based on science and application, which is fantastic, because without it, we wouldn't know half as much as we do. But I think that some people end up, you know, heavily criticising them over small details that it's really neither here nor there. There's much bigger things to worry about than those types of things. So if you get your recovery and your nutrition, your hydration and sleep sorted, you get much bigger payoff on this end of it. It depends. It depends. Yeah, there's no cookie cutter model. In saying that, this is what we're trying to do for our group here, because we've got people that'll come once a week and we've got people that'll come 6 times a week. So you need to cater for, or the way I look at it is I cater for someone that comes 6 times a week because I have to, essentially. If anyone comes less than that, well, they can get what they can fit in, but, you know, I'm certainly not going to hold back someone that's got enough dedication to turn up 6 times a week. You know, I want to make sure they're making progress.
So it's a solid hint to come 6 times a week?
100%, yeah. Up your membership to unlimited, quick. Well, you've all done the challenge recently, so I know you're capable of it. Okay, so what we look at here, though, this is on the surface of it, this looks pretty simple, right? So we've got a primary compound movement like a squat. We've got some leg extensions for accessories. We're focusing on quads here, obviously. Now, there's a bunch of different variations of the squat that we could employ. There's also things to consider about whether you've got individuals that have shoulder mobility issues, whether they need to be squatting on a safety bar, whether we've got beginners here that might be, this might actually be a goblet squat, a kettlebell squat. You know, it could be a dumbbell held in front. It could be squatting onto a bench, so a box squat of some sort. So there's any number of variations that can be applied to make this work for that particular person. I haven't had anyone at the moment that can't do leg extensions, but I'm sure I'll get someone that's got, you know, meniscus issues that gets aggravated by way of leg extensions, but hasn't happened just yet. But there's plenty of other, you know, sort of single jointed leg exercises that we can focus on in order to make that happen as well. All right, so when we look at, this is the traditional kind of bodybuilding set, but there's a period of time in between here. So if I'm doing 4 sets of this, rest breaks are going to need to be dictated here to some extent as well. So now, hard and fast rules on rest breaks I don't particularly have, but what I do like to do is that the heavier the loading, the more rest I like to give people, because I want them to maintain the heavy load. I don't want them to be dictated to by, you got 60 seconds to get back on the bar, and their form goes to rubbish, and then they can't maintain the intensity. So their muscle is not going to respond as well. The literature is pretty clear on this, that you can manipulate your rest breaks quite a bit in order to maximise hypertrophy. So maximising the load put on the muscle and the time taken between sets can be beneficial rather than detrimental. So if I come in too early, my technique's rubbish and I have to strip weight off the bar, that would not be as beneficial as me waiting an extra 60 seconds and getting the reps out that I need, good quality reps with the load that I need.
There's also like a mental wind-up to it, really, like, you know, depending on who you are.
Yeah, so look, when we get up here, I didn't put this in here, 0 reps in reserve. You know, this here is going to be a tough outing. So 4 sets of 6 on fairly heavy squats. Now 80%, there's going to be some people here that 80% isn't sufficient. Okay, might be 85, could be whatever, you know, but that's what we're looking for here, is the concept that the loading's going up as our repetitions are going down. So also we're looking at the intensity is moving up as well. So on these supplementary exercises, you're going to assume that the weight's going up because we've got 2 reps in reserve, 1 rep reserve, 1 rep reserve, 0 reps in reserve. So it's going to get harder. So this is going to require a much greater effort than this. Okay. So the other part about this is active rests for our quad sequences. So when I put together a session where we're dealing with the muscles here, we want to look at a couple of things, particularly as we get up here. We'll talk about tendons and how we look to assist in the development and maintenance of those. But the other part of here is the stability work. So being able to engage all of our muscles in order to keep us uninjured and safe, not only in the gym but outside of the gym. So when we look at active rest periods, there's a couple of things we can do with it. Let's say, for instance, we've got our 4 sets here and we've got an active rest. I'll call it an AR. So our active rest period could consist of something, if we were just looking for calorie burn, it'd be simply a 100-metre walk, like a walk of our outdoor track. That would assist in some calorie burn. So if we've got, 20 sets, 30 sets a week on one body part, and then, we're hitting half a dozen of those, we're going to add up to quite a few kilometres of extra walking a week just by going through our normal workout sessions. So we might hit 2Ks extra movement over the course of a session. So if you're on someone who's on a cutting diet or someone who's just looking to shed some extra kilos, it's a sneaky way of getting some cardio in without disrupting your ability to do your weight training. I wouldn't suggest running it, because if you run it, then when you come back to do this, you're going to have a negative effect on how much you can move. The other thing I like to do, and it has more of a potentially, I think, a slightly better benefit other than just burning calories, is a single leg stability drill. So one of my favourite ones would be a 3-way leg reach. So we've got an active rest drill that incorporates a 3-way leg reach. So that's essentially standing on one foot, moving your leg as far forward as you can, as far to the side as you can, as far to the rear as you can, without allowing it to touch the ground and without allowing the leg that you're standing on, that knee to dip in hard. So your glute on that leg that's standing on the ground needs to be very active, create stability through the knee and ankle junction, and that requires quite a bit of not only balance and coordination, but it also has a lot of extra muscle recruitment going on that is, I guess, somewhat instinctual. So if, for instance, you step off a step, or you have to bend over quickly, or there's an undulation in a ground or something like that, then you're better prepared for things like that that are not necessarily, prone to happening in the gym, but it could be anywhere. So yeah, it's almost like prehabilitation, I guess, so that anytime we are in those situations, we're less likely to give ourselves an injury that's going to hold us up from our progression in the gym. So it's another good way too of making sure that people are paying attention. We get a whole bunch of people that have got foot problems or, pronated feet, etc., collapsed arches, whatever the case may be, or they've had previous knee, ankle, hip injuries that cause them to have a sort of dysfunctional movement. Well, this gives us an opportunity to try and train everything into the right position, at least a few times a week. It's almost like physio corrective exercise without there being necessarily a correction that's required. Well, this way it doesn't do you any harm to do it, so we make use of it and it will be a benefit to some people. So that's kind of what our day one would look like through our hypertrophy phase up to here. Day 2, all we're going to do is supplement out a couple of these exercises for some alternatives. So we could pick any number of different squat variations depending on what our focus is, but I'm going to run with a leg press. Good old 45-degree leg press. So we go 45-degree leg press, and we would have a similar loading arrangement to what we have here. So that might be our compound lift, same set and rep scheme over the course of these particular weeks. So day 1, day 2 and day 3 of the week in question will be the same repetition and loading sequences, just different exercises incorporated. So we might have done a leg press here, and then we might go 15, we could do single leg strap squat. That might be day 2, and then day 3 we might move to a front squat and then combine that with a really nasty, so what have we got here, 6, 15 by hack squat. And if you know the weight of our hack squat machine, you know that that's going to be a very untidy day. So day 3, that's Friday mostly. So day 3 is going to be, you know, walking on Sunday, not much fun, Saturday afternoon. So what we can see here is we've got 3 different primary exercises. We've got a squat, we've got a 45-degree leg press, and we've got a front squat. And then we've got 3 accessory exercises here. We've got a leg extension, a single leg strap assisted squat, so like a pistol, but you've got some straps to assist. And the thing I like about the straps is it does a couple of things. So obviously, people that don't have the strength or the mobility, particularly through range of motion in the ankle, can be quite difficult to do the pistol squats. So the strap squat allows them to put their feet slightly forward of their knees and then sit back and down into it when they do a single leg squat. Still, they can moderate, make it more intense or less intense depending on how much pressure they put through the handles. So it really becomes quite a good exercise for people that are you know, beginners right through to advanced can still get quite a bit out of the same activity rather than having to change it. Now the hack squat, the only issue that I would see here is from a logistics perspective. So when we look at the hack squat, we've got 1 hack squat machine. We've actually got 2, so it might not be that much of an issue. The leg press converts into a hack squat. So technically we could probably make that work with the 2 machines. But if it did become an issue, there's a couple of other variations. We do have a bench press machine up the back where you can hook a strap over it. You can put your feet forward and perhaps elevate the heels a little bit and then sit back on it and do a very similar motion to a hack squat. An alternative to that might be no, they're probably the only 2 that I really like. You know, you could do things like a heels elevated goblet squat, but you are doing a front squat here, so I would say the hack squat's the one I'd like there. Now you could do lunges and step ups as well. I tend to actually like to put those more in with my posterior chain work, so like as a deadlift accessory rather than a quad based accessory. And you could argue the point whether, you know, your lunge is going to be more quad based or whether it's going to be more glute orientated. You could do Bulgarian splits. You could do single leg step ups on a box where you just put your foot up on the box and drive up from alongside it. That's another good one. So there's a whole raft of different activities. These just happen to be the ones that I've picked here this morning. So this may vary a little bit. Now, in regards to our assistance, our active rest drills. So we've got a 3-way leg reach. Another good one for our legs. We could have an active rest, which is forward plus rear hop. So it's simply just standing on one foot, hop forward, land on one foot, hop backwards, land on one foot, and do 5 on one side and 5 on the other. Again, creating that stability through that entire lower leg, right through up into the hip and the upper body, and also sort of progressing us a little bit as the weeks go on into some of the jump work that the athletics guys will be doing towards the end there. Okay, so that's generally our hypertrophy sequence and what that will pan out like. Now we would do the same if we had upper body. You might see something along the lines of bench press and incline dumbbell fly on day 1. You might see an incline dumbbell press and dips, for instance, on day 2. And then on day 3, you might get a flat dumbbell press and a seated cable fly, for argument's sake, on day 3. So, and that would be a similar sort of thing. Then as far as active rest is concerned, on chest, we could do anything from face pulls, where we're working to keep the scap and back of the shoulders in a healthy condition so that the arm sits in the correct position in the shoulder and we don't end up in this position where our chest is pulling everything forward. We're not working to keep our posture correct, in which case we can lead ourselves to, shoulder problems. We could do anything from, a lot of your banded external rotation work. You can do even just some simple prone shoulder mobility drills where you're face down, swimming the arms around the back, or at 90-degree raises or 45-degree raises. There's a whole raft of shoulder prehab drills that we can do in order to make sure that our scap's sitting in the right space. Okay, so that's what that looks like up to that point. So loading goes up, effort goes up, and we start to taper the reps in order to progress us into our next cycle. So the only other thing I would talk to people about, particularly in this phase, is looking at if they wanted to maximise this, we'd have a bit of a chat about nutrition. We'd make sure that we've got adequate calories. So ideally, I wouldn't have people in a deficit through this phase here. We want to be sort of calorie neutral or a surplus. Protein, 2 grams per kilo of body weight, and realistically just make sure you're fueled for your workouts. So, you know, probably having large periods of time where you're not consuming food, like intermittent fasting, etc. You know, I know some people love it, but as far as performance is concerned, I'm yet to be sold on the idea that it's great for optimal performance. Probably avoid any real endurance events if they're looking at maximising their time here. So, you know, don't go out and run 10 Ks in the morning and come and lift in the afternoon. Probably not ideal. If you do that, you're going to need a lot of calories, and you're going to need to fuel between events, etc.
Members are still choosing whether they're going athletic and strength.
Yeah. Okay, so this would be our hypertrophy block. So we'd start sprint warm-ups pretty much for everyone up to the end of the hypertrophy block. It's not going to do these guys who are going to choose to do strength testing at the end. It's not going to do them any harm. With our sprint warm-ups, we would try and bring those, raise the intensity almost parallel to this. So what you'll see is we might start them, day one might be as simple as we head outside, we do 2 at 50, 2 at 60, 2 at 70%, and it's a 20-metre sprint, walk the loop of the track, 20-metre sprint, walk the loop, and we just do that 3, you know, sort of six outings on that. That builds us up a little bit, and then gradually over time we'll increase that till we're hitting up to 90s, which would be 10 individual sprints, gradually ratchet it up. We would start to really focus on things like arm drive, focusing on start positions, focusing on making sure they're pushing the ground away with every step, looking at the movement efficiency and just determining whether everything is looking pretty close to the way that it should in order to be sprinting efficiently. And we're not getting too whipped up in the technical details. We're not training track athletes per se or professional players of any description, but we want to make sure that they're generally, you know, they've got a good drive angle, they're pushing the ground away, they are going, you know, through their acceleration phase in that angle and they're not standing bolt upright. They're making sure that they're bringing their knees through and they're not, you know, wasting a lot of energy moving sideways. Just the simple things like that, nothing too complicated. Okay, so baseline testing up here. If we're looking at athleticism, we've got our bench, squat and dead. That stays the same. Squat, dead, overhead, seated, I like, and our chin up. Now that is common to strength as well.
Do you do seated to take out any drive from the body?
Yep. I'm looking at upper body strength in 2 planes. So bench being horizontal and then vertical pull. And we just take that out because a lot of people on their overhead press can basically push jerk it. They end up under the bar, they end up dropping under the bar rather than them pushing the bar up. And there's nothing wrong with a push jerk, great activity, but it's not what we're testing here. We want to develop some actual pressing strength. And then, so this would be our strength stuff, just stops there, but athleticism, you get a couple of extra tests in here. So we'll run a 20-metre sprint, 3-cone, agility. The 3-cone drill we're using is not the same as the NFL one where it's like an L shape. This one's just a straight cone in the middle, cone at either end of our 20-metre track, so 10 metres, 10 metres. And they start from the middle cone, they sprint down to the cone at the start, they do a full 180-degree turn, sprint to the last cone, 180-degree turn, and then sprint all the way home. Okay, so it's like a 10-second test, a bit less, somewhere thereabouts. 20-metre sprint. This one, no one likes. Boot test. It sucks. Standing broad jump. And that is about it, my friend. So we're looking at obviously acceleration for our 20-metre sprint. We're looking at some agility, change of direction ability just here. We're looking at some cardiovascular fitness for our boot test, and we're looking at some lower body power production through here. I mean, if we wanted to, we could do a bunch of other tests like upper body med ball throws or something of that nature, but this gives us a reasonable cross section by the time you incorporate those other strength tests out. All right, so that's kind of what we're aiming for with this. So this is just building a foundation so that we can build the strength. Once we build the strength, we can translate that strength into moving things a little more quickly. Move things a little more quickly, then we can maximise some of these tests up here. So regarding our strength, we've finished this off on 6s. So I'm probably going to start strength somewhere in the vicinity of 3 sets by 5s. Let's just choose the same activity, just for continuity here. 85% on the squat, 3 by 5 at 85. The 3 by 5 at 85, I like to actually incorporate some of our strongman stuff into our strength work. It does a couple of things. It doesn't make the work anywhere near as stale as what it can get. You know, we can get quite monotonous under a bar all the time. So if we can find like movements, you know, things like when you're doing deadlifts and you do stone loading or farmer's carry or tire flips or something of that nature, you know, something that works a similar movement pattern. Instead of doing overhead press, we might do a log. You know, things like that that just add a little tiny bit of, if we want to coin the term functional movement, we can call them functional movements. But basically, it adds a little bit of variety, works as similar muscle groups, and we can utilise it in our program. Why not? You know, keeps people interested, I think. So when we're hitting this, we might do 5 on the squat. And then we might combine that with 1 by, let's call it 15 metre, be realistic. I like to say that it's 20, but it's not really. 15 metre sled drag, unless we move all the other equipment out of the way, and nobody ever really does that. So 1 15 metre sled drag, so it'd be like a rearward pull. And our active rests could essentially be similar to what we're doing here, 3-way leg reach, forward hops, rearward hops, this sort of thing. So that would be, you know, indicative of what a day might look like there. The other thing to consider is when we get into this strength phase, I'll start to incorporate some additional things into our warm-up sequences which are important as far as core stabilisation is concerned. So there's a few exercises that we utilise, things like the bird dog and the side plank, and there's a McGill roll up. I like Stu McGill's work when it comes to that. And we'll probably start incorporating that on the tail end of these last couple of hypertrophy weeks, and then roll it in through the strength weeks. And it's just an extra 5 minutes work that we do during the warm-up sequence. Equally, when we get into these faster sprints, for the guys doing the athleticism, we'll throw in a couple of extra drills for them, which gives some more hip mobility and making sure our hamstrings are good and in a great position before we start our sprint work. So the warm-up will change on the tail end just by adding a couple of minutes work to it, which will hopefully minimise our chances of getting any sort of other injuries in place. The same with the sprint progressions. As we move through the sprint progressions, we'll start to do things like falling starts. We start to do some reactive work, which I'll talk about up here a little bit, so that we increase the we're going to increase our output basically. So we're going to react more quickly. We're going to cause the person to have to eventually think, react and move, and then when that happens, we end up in a position where we've just got a faster athlete. When we move into the strength side here, we've got our squats, we've got our sled drag. Active rest drills will be very similar to what we've done down here. So there's a couple of things that we could venture into as we move through here. We could do more leg press and just increase loading, reduce reps, and basically follow this almost all the way through. But I like to try and throw in a couple of different types of squats in order to hopefully help these guys, because they are going to be tested on their squat. So having some squats that are slightly different movements to perform, we're going to hopefully pick up on some of the weak points in their chain, develop slightly different parts of their leg, back, hip junction, etc. And that's going to hopefully have some carryover so that when they do their 1RM testing, that it becomes, they get a better result out of it. Inevitably, if you were doing something that was more specific for, if this was a competition, for instance, I would, these last few weeks would be pretty much only what they're going to do for their competition. I wouldn't try and modify that too much, just so that they're getting used to that movement pattern more regularly. But here, we're still developing strength. It's early in the piece, it's a baseline test, so we can maximise it as we go on. So with our squats, we might go to 5 by front squat. We've got our sled drag there, so the option here is we could move into another accessory activity, such as some hack squats or something of that nature. But what we might look at, run with 3 sets again. I'll come back to that. I've got a couple of options here. Let's see what I put in here. So we've got sumo box squat, Louis Simmons' favourite. Sumo box squat, we'll run 3 sets. We do 5s here as well. My thoughts with this are a little bit mixed, and I'll tell you why. Is because when we're working through some of these single joint movements down here, this higher repetition range, I like to kind of end up here in strength without ending up in a situation where I'm producing a lot of DOMs for the day subsequent. So if I start to put in really high repetition single leg movements that are going to build up a lot of metabolic stress, generally speaking, there is probably going to be some DOMs associated with that. And then when we get back to doing these sets here, there may be a chance that it's going to reduce my ability to perform on there. So on occasion, what I would do is I would actually have this as either no secondary exercise whatsoever, so just be front squat with your active rest drill, or I can put in a secondary activity here which hopefully won't cause too much carryover as far as DOMs are concerned. Okay, so I'm in 2 minds about what I insert there.
That's just because you created the environment for the testing.
Yeah, 100%. So, well, what I want is I want to be able to, we've only got 2 weeks on this strength phase, which is a lot shorter than I would normally do. So we're kind of looking at how am I going to maximise performance here without really impacting on it. I don't have a month to build up through the strength phase. So I don't want to waste any of my main compound lifts by screwing around with a lot of accessory work that's going to give me some grief. I'm actually going to go back to using our 45-degree leg press, but I might throw it on this day just because people like to mix things up a little bit. I'm going to run back to sets of 8. So we're just on the verge of, on the lower end of some hypertrophy work there, but still pretty heavy. And I'm going to run with an 8 on a hack squat. That could be 6s. Really neither here nor there. And as far as reps in reserve are concerned, we'd probably be looking at about 1. Now, for the people that are doing the athleticism, they're more than likely their general program will look like their warm-up, their sprint warm-up. They'll do the basics of their lifts, and then they'll move into a conditioning piece on the end. For those that by this stage have made up their mind that, okay, we're definitely moving through into strength, we're not going to bother with the athleticism, then we could potentially increase this to 4 sets around, or we can add a bunch of accessory work to it as well. So, you know, particularly those that are lifting heavy, you're going to see things like GHD, you're going to see things like good mornings, you're going to see things, probably some glute activity as well, reverse hypers, and a bunch of other activities that we use in order to strengthen some of those posterior chain muscles that are copying a fair brunt of load there. So that potentially could end up looking, you know, from something like this with an extra 3 sets of, could be anything out to 20 reps on some of those accessory activities in place of the conditioning piece on the end. Yeah. Whereas the athletics guys, obviously, because they're going to be doing a beat test at some point, still going to require some sort of foundational aerobic base on the tail end of it. All right, so then we move through into starting to get into this next strength phase, which is where I will start to introduce. So our active rest here has been, it's all been kind of static work up to this point. It hasn't been anything dynamic. This week and this week, we move into some dynamic stuff. So here, for instance, so we've got the same exercise. We've got our squats going down to triples at 90 to 95%, somewhere around there. So we're getting pretty heavy on. Now with some of these accessory days here, I'd be looking at putting in contrast sets. So what we've got here is a heavy squat. When we move through our heavy squat, we're then going to add to that a faster, more dynamic movement. So that could be anything from, let's lay this out day one. So when we look at our heavy squat, we're going to follow that up with something dynamic. And you could structure this, you could do like a French contrast method, which would be 3 or 4 exercises layered for short repetitions, and they get increasingly fast. So if you can imagine a force velocity curve, which just means that one side of the curve is all your really high strength work, and then the other side of the curve is your speed work. And as you get closer from one to the other, obviously the loading goes down as you get faster. So it's just trying to strike that through from one part to the next. So if we go triples on the squat, we're going to add then somewhere in the vicinity of 3 by loaded box jump would be one option. So it'd be like dumbbells in hand up onto a box. Now if I wanted to make this looking into a situation where, well, no, I'll add that to the next one, we'll see. We could then add stuff that conditions our tendons as well. So tendons have been shown, collagen in the tendons has been shown to react well to elastic type activities. So when we get something that utilises like a stretch shortening cycle, so when we contract our muscles and we hit the ground, say for instance on a jump, and I absorb the impact into my feet as my feet come to the bottom of the bottom of the movement. I've gone through that eccentric load, I've hit the isometric at the bottom, and then I concentrically push up. There's a little bit of elastic energy in there that's free. As we come to the bottom, the muscle tendon connection gets put under some stretch, and then as it shortens and returns, we get some free energy. It's like why we don't have to, when we walk, we don't have to kind of push our feet away, or when we run, we get that little bit of free spring, same sort of thing. So our tendons work well to that. So if we spend all of our time working our muscle but don't work our tendon, we can end up with an imbalance where, you know, I'm doing a lot of strength activity but no explosive activity. Muscles are super strong, tendons aren't so strong. If we end up with a situation where they become under great strain, well, the weak link's going to go. So then the tendon gets the tear rather than the muscle getting the tear. If we can bring them up in balance, less chance of that happening. Triples on a loaded box jump, and then your active rest drill as we described. This one here, we might go 3 by front squat, same activities, same percentage, 90, 95%. This one here we might do triple hurdle jump. Now that would be a good example of something that would make use of our stretch shortening cycle. Okay, and then here we're going to do the same thing, sumo box, and we might be like 95% triples. And realistically, you could do anything. You could do a sled sprint, 5 metre, 10 metre sled sprint, you know.
With the testing, you do back squats, right?
Yep.
So do you, if I'm old mate that missed day 1, I can come in on day 2.
Yep.
You prescribe back
Back
squat
squat.
because you're working up to it
Yeah, 100%. So what I end up doing is, the first option will be the main exercise, squat, bench, deads. And then generally, like, let's say, for instance, we looked at deadlifts. I might do deadlift, sumo deadlift, snatch grip deadlift as 3 examples. I come in day 3, I've missed day 1, day 2, conventional deadlift. Yep.
Do you allow people to do different styles on their baselines?
Yeah, so there's going to be some people that cannot deadlift from the floor. There's going to be some people that cannot squat with a regular back squat just because of shoulder mobility restrictions. There's going to be some people that I won't even allow to squat below parallel. You know, maybe they'll just get to parallel because of hip mobility issues or an inability to maintain neutral at the bottom of the squat. So they end up with a massive butt wink. And, you know, there seems to be, there's a lot of people that bang on about coaching that out and being able to do this and that. And in my experience, yeah, probably 95% of it you can coach out, but there's always that anomaly. There are a number of people, particularly older people, that have perhaps had, you know, injuries or whatever it might be, that you've got to, you know, you can't simply just go, yeah, you must do that. If the movement isn't safe, we're not going to prescribe it. You know, we'll work around it and we'll get them testing in something that allows them still to get a maximal test out, and it's a benchmark. It's just a marking point so that down the track they can retest on that same quality and know that they've gained something. Okay?
But if you look at someone like Marty on the opposite end, like if he can pull heavier sumo dead, are you letting him do that, or are you training up his conventional to?
Yep, so I'll let them choose whether they want to do sumo or conventional. I'll just obviously note that. But there's some that I won't change up. So the only other change I might make is, say, things like a chin up. Obviously, some people simply can't do a chin up. Other people are going to do max chin ups, and that's fine. But, you know, and there's strict quality control on what these are. So, say for instance, with the chin up, you know, we don't allow butterfly kipping. We don't allow any of those sorts of activities. It's straight down. It's up to the bar, down, 1 second pause, up to the bar, down, 1 second pause. The overheads are unsupported, so seated, unsupported and overhead. If someone has significant mobility problems and they can't manage that, then we'll allow them to use a back support, but it must be close to 90 degrees. And then if someone who simply can't get into the position at all without compromising their shoulders, then we just scratch that test. They're not ready for it yet, okay? Yeah, a deadlift, we could trap bar people, or we could have a standard to say, you know, if they lose that spinal neutrality at the bottom, then we would perhaps say, okay, well, you can lift off a 2-inch block and we'll keep our measurements consistently on that 2-inch block. So every time you pull on the 2-inch block. Yep. And then moving on to our power speed round here. So day 1 for power speed, we're going to stick, there's 2 ways we could approach this. If we're moving to the athletic side of things, and given that we're doing all this testing within a close proximity, you could argue that we need to retain that heavy stuff for this period in time so that we get that nice smooth transition into it, but there will be some speed sacrifices. You can't train one with the other and maximise both of them simultaneously. But the drop off for strength is much longer. Yeah, so I'm going to retain 80%. Isharin, I think, Vladimir Isharin does a pretty good, Russian strength coach, he's got a pretty good table that they use for periodising athletes for events. And when you take a look at that amongst, you know, there's lots of other people that have done this as well, it's just one that comes to mind, where they chronologically list how long and what percentage drop off you get with these various activities. So for instance, you know, they claim that, I think it's at 12 weeks, you retain 80% plus of strength gains even if you don't train strength. You know, whereas something like speed, 7 to 10 days, you start to lose percentages off your speed. The same with your muscle hypertrophy, tends to go within a few weeks. You know, so there's different qualities evaporate more quickly. So the closer you can train, ideally, you know, if you've got something coming up, you want to train those qualities that disappear quickly more closely to the event. Yeah. So if we look at speed here, if I had someone that was doing purely more the speed stuff, we would go on our squat. We might do 3 by squat at 50% with bands, so like a band resisted squat. Then we might add 3 by dumbbell half squat jump. What I mean by half squat jump is you're not going deep into a full squat, sort of like halfway through, so down to about a 45-degree angle, and then push, jump, push, jump, push, jump. And then you might do, if you were doing, give you an illustration of a French contrast set, as we could go from this to 3 by band assisted jumps. Given the the band assisted jump is where you hook a band above you, put your arms through the band so you've got the band pulling you up, and then you squat jump, squat jump, squat jump, and the assistance actually means that you're jumping faster and higher than you would be able to normally. So it's like over speed work in the traditional sense of things. So you've gone through from if you look at that on a force velocity curve, you've gone from slightly slower, still not slow by any stretch, because you've got some band resistance there, so it causes you to push and break the resistance as you get towards the top. Obviously there's more resistance, but you're further through the movement. You've got something that's slightly loaded but performed faster than this. Then you've got something that's not loaded at all and performed faster again. And you could layer that up with 4 exercises. And with this one here, when you're doing, I'd still do similar active rest would be the same, and reasonable rest breaks, but you might put this out as many as, depending on how you go, 5 sets, because it's quite a short sequence to go through. Or potentially you might put in, the active rest could be longer in duration. So you might put in some other core activity or something else, some other prehab work that you wanted to develop when you did that, okay? Other ones that you can do here when we're getting right into the end speed work, and I'll do one more day up here. So we can do our 3 by squat jump. So
essentially the last leg day before the test week. Yeah, coming through there. It's 3 by squat jump, so barbell loaded, but it might only be like 25% loading, and you're just doing triples on a squat jump. So again, you probably go down to just above parallel on this. If you wanted to make it a fixed point, you could go from a box, jump up, back down, jump up, back down. Once we've done our 3 squat jump, then we could move to an intermediately loaded activity, but with reactivity. So what I mean by that is you could do something along the lines of a good athlete. You could do, say, 5 or 6 times single leg box jump and reactive. Might do 5 sets around on that, plus reactive rest. So the single leg reactive box jump could be on a hand signal. So you line your athletes up behind a box, they're all facing you. You go left hand, right hand, means that when they jump up, they'll land with that foot. They jump up, they'll land on that foot. And good athletes can go off one leg up onto the box and land on one leg. Athletes that aren't quite up to that could go from 2 feet and land on the one. So that could be an example of a go, no-go kind of situation, and you can balk them a little bit and do these things and get them to react. Other things that you could do as far as reactivity is concerned is you can do simple things like a dynamic bear crawl is another one that I like to do, but it's a bit hard to manage when you've got big numbers. So you use 2 cable machines, hook up a shoulder strap to the athlete, and then put a cone down on the floor at the end of the bear crawl run. So our cable machines give you probably a 3-metre bear crawl run, and then you can do the same thing. You can either give them a verbal command where they need to react to it. So it could be, you know, you're going to go on the even number, okay, and you might go, all right, 5 plus 5, you know, 5 plus 7, whatever, and get them. They've got to process, think, and go. And the first one to crawl out, sees the cone, wins. You could do it on other, you know, simple reactive sprint drills, you know, hands touching each other, and it's a left or right drop, and got to make it to a marker without getting tagged by the other person. There's any number of reactive drills you can do in order to stimulate that fast response, and there's a bit of carryover to that
when they start doing some of the sprint work as we move into the program proper, because these sprint drills will start, as I said, very low key down here. By the time we move through to here, we will have made use of that fight or flight response that's naturally wired into humans. So if someone's chasing you, push that little bit harder, you know. There's always that up your sleeve. So, but we need to be very careful as we move through this, that we are conditioning the tendons, making sure that all of our connective tissue is healthy, making sure that we're paying attention to injuries as they arise or little niggles, so that we don't aggravate them through this process. So that's just an example of how one exercise, basically the squat, might progress through a bunch of different states in order to meet a goal at the end. Now, the only difference might be that we would eliminate perhaps some of this for the strength guys, and that we would again put in some more assistance work, but banded work in this week will probably stay for the strength guys, but this might stay at around that 50%. We might then transfer that to some of these other exercises, and some of the assistance work will probably disappear, and we would just up the volume. So we might be like 5 by 5 at 50% with bands on the squat for them, for instance. And then by the time they do their deadlifts, it'll be in the same sort of boat with all their assistance work. The athletics guys might only do 3 or 4 sets of it, and we would vary that depending on time frames, how much time we got. Any questions for me, Barn?
No, it's awesome.
That's, yeah, like there's plenty more to talk about, but that's a start.